Most people have always looked at this ransom note and accepted it as simple evidence, proof that someone desperate, someone dangerous was behind the kidnapping. But that's exactly where the mistake begins. Because when investigators originally focused on the obvious meaning of the words, they may have overlooked something far more disturbing, something that doesn't stand out at first glance, but changes the entire interpretation of the message. What if this note was never just a demand for money, as initially reported in early coverage by Los Angeles News and later discussed in FBI official briefings, but something far more calculated? Something designed not just to demand payment, but to manipulate perception from the very beginning. Something structured in a way that could mislead investigators, redirect suspicion, or even shape how the entire public understood the case. Because once you look beyond the surface interpretation and consider what was actually highlighted in official analysis and media reporting, a different possibility starts to emerge, one that suggests the wording may not have been random panic at all, but a carefully constructed message with a hidden purpose behind it. Now, before we go any further, understand this. What you're about to see is not widely discussed in mainstream coverage of this case. Inside this ransom note, there are specific word choices, patterns, and hidden contradictions that were never fully explained in official summaries or courtroom discussions. Most people read past them without realizing their importance. But once you actually see them, you can't unsee them. Because they don't just raise questions about the note itself, they raise questions about the mindset behind it, about whether the message was written in panic or carefully constructed to control how the entire investigation unfolded from the very beginning. And in the next section, we're going to break it down step by step so you can decide for yourself what was really being communicated and what might have been intentionally hidden in plain sight. It begins with what every investigation fears most: a disappearance that offers no immediate explanation. Nancy Guthrie's case first emerged as a missing persons report that quickly escalated into something far more disturbing. According to early local law enforcement bulletins, she was last seen under circumstances that initially appeared routine, an ordinary moment that within hours transformed into a full-scale criminal investigation. But what investigators were not prepared for was what came next, because this wasn't just a disappearance. A written message was discovered, a ransom note. At first, authorities treated it as a standard kidnapping scenario, a targeted abduction, a demand-driven crime. But even in those earliest hours, something about the situation didn't sit right with experienced detectives on the scene. And the question quietly emerged inside the investigation room: if this was a simple kidnapping, why did it feel staged? The first official narrative released to the public was cautious, controlled, and deliberately limited. Law enforcement confirmed that Nancy Guthrie was missing and that a ransom communication had been received. Media outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as an active abduction case. The public reaction was immediate: shock, fear, and a growing sense of vulnerability. A community that once felt ordinary was now gripped by a single unsettling realization: if it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. But behind closed doors, investigators were already noticing contradictions in the early evidence, and those contradictions were not small. They were structural. According to early briefings referenced by local news agencies at the time, authorities confirmed that the ransom note contained demands, but what it did not contain was just as important as what it did. No clear identity, no consistent motive, and no typical behavioral markers that seasoned investigators expect in traditional kidnapping for ransom cases. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Was this really about money, or was the ransom note serving a different purpose entirely? A message rather than a demand. As the public digested fragmented updates, fear began to spread faster than facts. Neighbors reportedly began locking doors earlier than usual. Local schools reviewed security protocols. Social media speculation escalated within hours, filling the vacuum left by limited official information. But behind closed doors, investigators were facing a very different kind of pressure. Because while the public saw a missing person case, law enforcement was seeing inconsistencies that didn't align with a clean abduction timeline. For example, the timing of the disappearance itself remained unclear in early reports. Witness statements did not fully align, and small gaps in the timeline began to widen under closer scrutiny. At first, these gaps were dismissed as normal confusion in a high-stress situation, but experienced detectives know something crucial. In real abduction cases, timelines don't usually blur this quickly. They fracture for a reason. And then came the most disturbing development of all. The ransom note itself began to raise internal debate. Was it authentic, or was it constructed to simulate a kidnapping scenario? Some investigators reportedly questioned whether the language used in the note reflected genuine coercion or something more calculated, something rehearsed, something designed to control perception rather than simply extract a demand. And if that was true, then the entire direction of the investigation could be wrong from the very beginning.
Psychological analysts brought into the case later began examining a different angle. Not just who took Nancy Guthrie, but why the situation was presented in this particular way. In many staged crime scenarios, experts note a pattern. The offender doesn't just commit the act, they construct a narrative around it. A narrative that misleads investigators, delays response time, and creates confusion in the earliest critical hours of investigation. And here, that possibility could not be ignored. Because the ransom note didn't just communicate demands, it controlled attention, it shaped urgency, it dictated the entire first impression of the case. But if the narrative was being controlled, then one question becomes unavoidable. What was being hidden in those first hours? And more importantly, who benefited from that confusion? As investigators pushed deeper into the early timeline, another detail began to surface, one that was not widely discussed in initial media coverage. Certain behaviors in the immediate aftermath did not align with typical victimology patterns seen in standard kidnapping cases. The responses, the timing, and the sequence of events suggested something more complex might be occurring beneath the surface. But at the time, there was no confirmation of anything beyond a missing person and a ransom demand. So officials maintained a careful public stance. "We are pursuing all leads," they stated in early briefings, and treating this as an active kidnapping investigation. A standard phrase, but behind it, pressure was building. Because if this was a kidnapping, then where was the urgency from the offender? And if it wasn't, then what exactly had happened to Nancy Guthrie? The case was now locked in a dangerous space between two realities. One possibility suggested a straightforward abduction for ransom. The other hinted at something far more calculated, something involving manipulation, staging, and deliberate misdirection from the very beginning. And as investigators would soon realize, the ransom note might not have been the starting point of the crime. It may have been the starting point of the deception. But that realization was still ahead, and what they discovered next would begin to unravel everything they thought they knew about the case. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries.
It was the moment investigators feared most in any kidnapping case. Because once a ransom note enters the investigation, everything changes. Nancy Guthrie's case was no different. According to early law enforcement reports, the ransom note was recovered shortly after the disappearance was confirmed. It did not arrive days later. It did not surface through an anonymous leak. It appeared almost immediately within the early investigative window, when chaos was still unfolding and facts were still unstable. And that timing is where the first question begins.
How does a kidnapper produce a written demand so quickly, unless the plan was already in motion before the disappearance was even reported? At first, the note became the central piece of evidence. Detectives treated it as the anchor point of the entire investigation. Every lead, every timeline reconstruction, every public statement began from that single document. Because in kidnapping cases, the ransom note is not just communication, it is intention made visible. It is the offender speaking directly into the investigation. But what investigators were about to realize was that this note did not behave like a typical ransom demand. The first official descriptions of the document were cautious. According to early briefings referenced by local media outlets at the time, the note contained structured demands tied to an unspecified exchange. However, what stood out immediately to investigators was not just what was written, but how it was written. The handwriting was described as unusually controlled, not chaotic, not hurried, but deliberate, almost too deliberate. Some analysts reportedly noted a strange inconsistency. The writing style appeared neither fully emotional nor purely mechanical. It sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, structured enough to suggest planning, yet detached enough to raise psychological questions about intent. And that is where the first contradiction emerged. Because most ransom notes carry emotional pressure, this one felt calculated. At the scene, investigators examined the physical characteristics of the note: paper type, ink behavior, spacing, alignment. At first glance, none of it appeared remarkable. But forensic analysts often say the most important evidence is what does not stand out immediately. The paper showed no obvious signs of last-minute improvisation, no torn edges suggesting urgency, no smudging that would indicate panic or environmental stress. Instead, it appeared preserved, controlled, almost prepared in advance, and that detail quietly shifted the direction of internal discussions. Was this note created in the moment, or was it already waiting to be used? When investigators first briefed local media, the public interpretation was simple. A kidnapping had occurred, a ransom demand had been issued, and law enforcement was treating it as an active extortion case. News outlets quickly amplified that narrative, focusing on urgency and public safety concerns. Headlines emphasized danger, abduction, and the possibility of negotiation. But behind those headlines, investigators were already struggling with a deeper uncertainty, because the note did not fully match the emotional profile of a typical abduction scenario. And in criminal behavior analysis, that mismatch is never ignored for long.
According to behavioral experts later consulted during similar investigations, ransom communications often reflect one of two psychological states: desperation or dominance. Desperation produces messy language, emotional instability, and inconsistent structure. Dominance produces control, precision, and narrative manipulation. This note leaned dangerously toward the second category, and that raised a disturbing possibility. If this was not an act of desperation, then was it an act of control? At this stage of the investigation, one detail became increasingly important, but was not immediately understood. The tone of the message did not escalate emotionally as expected. There were no visible signs of internal conflict from the writer, no breakdown in structure, no linguistic instability. Instead, it maintained a steady, almost rehearsed tone, as if the message had been composed, reviewed, and finalized before being delivered into the investigation. And that is when one investigator reportedly asked a question that would linger inside the case file. Who writes a ransom note like they already know how the investigation will respond? But even more unsettling was what the note did not include. No personal identifiers, no emotional reference to the victim, no visible psychological leverage points that kidnappers typically use to intensify urgency. It was transactional, detached, almost clinical, and that absence created a vacuum of meaning.
Because when emotional intent is missing from a kidnapping demand, investigators must ask whether the purpose of the note is not to communicate with the victim's family, but to communicate with the investigators themselves. At first, this interpretation was not officially adopted. It was too early, too speculative. But internally, the contradiction remained unresolved. Because every experienced detective knows a simple truth. In real kidnapping cases, ransom notes are rarely just demands. They are behavioral fingerprints. And fingerprints never lie. They only reveal intent when you know how to read them correctly. As the investigation progressed, another unsettling detail surfaced during internal review. The note appeared to guide attention in a very specific direction, not toward a suspect, not toward a location, but toward a narrative framework, a framework that shaped how the public understood the crime from the very first hour. And that is when a disturbing possibility emerged. What if the ransom note was never meant to resolve the case? What if it was meant to delay its resolution? Because once investigators began re-examining the document, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable question. If this note was designed with control in mind, then who was it controlling? The victim's family? The public? Or the investigation itself? And at that point, something shifted inside the case file. What once looked like a straightforward ransom communication now appeared as a potential instrument of misdirection. A carefully structured message that may not only describe the crime, but conceal its true nature. And as investigators would soon discover, the most important clues were not what the note said, but what it carefully avoided saying. Because that silence would eventually become louder than the words themselves. But that was only the beginning. What investigators uncovered next would force them to question whether the ransom note was evidence of a kidnapping at all, or the first layer of a much deeper deception already in motion. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries. The ransom note is no longer just evidence. It is now a psychological map. Because when investigators began breaking it down line by line, they weren't just reading a message, they were reading intent. And what they discovered was far more unsettling than the kidnapping theory alone. According to early investigative transcripts, the note begins with a direct opening statement, identifying the situation and establishing control over the communication. A simple introduction, confirming the victim's status and initiating the demand structure. What stands out immediately is the absence of emotional volatility. No panic, no aggression spikes. Instead, a neutral, almost procedural tone. And that is where the first contradiction appears. Because most ransom communications begin with emotional pressure. This begins with structure. Not fear, not rage, structure. Investigators reportedly noted that the phrasing was unusually formal for a kidnapping scenario. It lacked colloquial urgency. There were no broken sentences, no linguistic instability. It reads more like a prepared statement than an emotional demand. Behavioral analysts later suggested this could indicate premeditation rather than impulsivity. But if this was planned, then the offender wasn't reacting to the crime. They were executing it. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How far in advance was this message prepared? But this is where it starts to get strange, because the tone doesn't shift, it escalates, and not emotionally, strategically. The demand segment. The central portion of the note outlines the ransom demand itself, a request or condition for the victim's release in exchange for compliance. On the surface, it appears straightforward, but investigators quickly noticed something unusual. The demand is not emotionally anchored. There is no personalization tied to the victim, no reference to fear, harm, or urgency escalation, just instruction. Controlled, detached, almost transactional. And that detachment is what unsettled investigators most. Because even professional criminals under pressure often reveal emotional leakage in language. Here, There is none. One forensic linguist reportedly pointed out that the wording resembles administrative communication more than criminal extortion. Phrases are structured, measured, even balanced in length. It reads less like a threat and more like a protocol. This suggests something critical. The writer is not overwhelmed by emotion. They are regulating it. And when emotional suppression is that precise, it can indicate either advanced psychological control or complete emotional detachment from the victim. But there's a third possibility investigators briefly considered. What if the demand is not the real purpose of this section at all? What if it is simply a distraction layer?
Because this next line changes everything. The structure begins to shift again, subtly, but noticeably. The threat segment. This section contains the implied consequences of non-compliance, a warning of harm or escalation if demands are not met. But unlike typical ransom notes, the threat here is not vividly described. It is restrained, almost deliberately minimal. What investigators found most disturbing was what was missing. There is no emotional amplification, no graphic language, no escalation of fear through imagery, just a simple conditional warning. And that restraint is not typical, because most offenders amplify fear to gain compliance. This note does not amplify anything. It stabilizes. The phrasing reportedly avoids strong verbs and emotional triggers. Instead, it relies on conditional structure, if and then logic patterns. This gives the message an almost legalistic quality, as if the writer is outlining consequences, not threatening them. Behavioral profilers later suggested a potential dominance control mindset, not a chaotic offender, but a structured thinker, someone who may prioritize psychological control over physical intimidation. And that is significantly more dangerous in investigative terms, because it suggests calculation, not reaction. But then investigators noticed something else, a contradiction hiding inside the restraint itself. Why would a kidnapper avoid emotional pressure in a ransom scenario unless emotional pressure was never the goal? But that was only the beginning, because the final section of the note would raise even more disturbing questions. The final sentence of the ransom note was expected to conclude with urgency or reinforcement. Instead, investigators found something far more ambiguous, a closing statement ending the communication. Simple, final, detached. No escalation, no closure reinforcement, no emotional signature, just termination. And that absence of emotional closure is itself significant, because offenders who are emotionally invested typically reinforce their message at the end. Here, the message simply stops. The closing is notably clean, no redundancy, no emphasis, no emotional echo. It reads like a document that was finished, not written in distress. Forensic analysts reportedly highlighted this as one of the strongest indicators of pre-planning, because the ending does not feel like a conclusion of thought. It feels like completion of a task, and that distinction changes everything.
At this stage, investigators began stepping back from the content and focusing on something more disturbing: the structure of the entire note. Because when each section is viewed individually, it appears coherent. But when viewed together, a pattern emerges, not of emotion, not of panic, but of control architecture. A document designed not just to communicate, but to guide interpretation. And that leads to a chilling possibility investigators could not ignore. What if the ransom note was never meant to reflect the crime, but to shape how the crime would be understood? Behavioral experts later suggested that the consistent emotional suppression across all sections could indicate a perpetrator with high cognitive control and low emotional reactivity.
But even more unsettling was another interpretation, that the writer may have been aware of investigative psychology itself, structuring language not just to communicate with the victim's family, but to anticipate how law enforcement would analyze it, as if the note was designed with investigative counter-reading in mind. And if that is true, then the message was never just evidence, it was an interaction with the investigation itself, a psychological chess move made before detectives even entered the board. And once investigators realized that, they were forced to confront a new and far more disturbing question. If every line of the ransom note was intentional, then what else in this case was designed to mislead from the very beginning? But the answer to that would only begin to emerge in the next phase of the investigation. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries.
At this stage of the investigation, the ransom note was no longer being read as a message. It was being read as a behavioral fingerprint. Because according to early case analysis reports, investigators began noticing something unsettling. The language itself was not just structured, it was patterned. And patterns in criminal psychology are never accidental. Repeated words and controlled emphasis. The first analytical layer focused on repetition. Investigators reportedly identified repeated phrasing patterns throughout the note, subtle echoes of instruction-like language that appeared more than once, almost reinforcing specific ideas. Certain words and structural phrases were reused or mirrored within different sections of the message. At first, this was dismissed as normal linguistic habit, but then analysts noticed something more disturbing. The repetition was not random, it appeared strategic. Behavioral linguists suggest repetition in written criminal communication can serve one of two purposes: either emotional reinforcement or psychological control. And in this case, the repetition did not feel emotional, it felt instructional, as if the writer was not expressing urgency, but reinforcing obedience. And that raises a chilling question. Who exactly was being instructed? The victim's family or the investigators reading the note? But this is where it starts to get strange, because repetition was only the surface layer. The structure itself began to raise even deeper concerns. Unusually organized structure. Investigators then shifted focus from wording to composition, and what they found immediately disrupted expectations. The ransom note followed a clear, segmented structure: opening, demand, threat, and closure. At first glance, this appeared logical, almost helpful. But experienced investigators know something crucial. Real criminal panic rarely organizes itself so cleanly. As noted in FBI behavioral analysis discussions on structured threat communications, high-stress offenders typically display linguistic fragmentation, broken syntax, emotional overflow, inconsistent sequencing. But this note did not fragment, it aligned, almost like it had been pre-arranged into sections before being written. And that creates a disturbing possibility. If the structure is too perfect, then was it written under pressure or constructed without pressure at all? Because if there was no emotional breakdown in the writing, then there may have been no emotional breakdown during the act itself. And that changes everything. Behavioral psychology shift. At this point, analysts began asking a more uncomfortable question. Not just what the note says, but what kind of mind could produce it? The language does not reflect emotional instability commonly associated with abduction-driven ransom demands. Instead, it reflects consistency, restraint, and controlled messaging. And that inconsistency with expected behavior became the focal point of psychological debate. Some behavioral experts reportedly suggested two competing interpretations. First, a highly controlled offender capable of suppressing emotional leakage under stress. Second, something far more unusual. An individual attempting to simulate what a ransom note should sound like. Because there is a subtle but important difference between natural criminal communication and constructed criminal communication. One is instinctive, the other is performative. And if this note is performative, then the writer may not be revealing intent at all. They may be acting out a role. But why would someone do that? And who benefits from a staged perception of a kidnapping? Investigators reportedly began rereading the note from a completely different perspective, not as communication, but as imitation. And that is when a disturbing realization emerged. Certain phrases didn't just appear structured, they appeared familiar, as if drawn from generalized expectations of what ransom language is supposed to look like. And that leads to a chilling possibility. What if the note was not written by a kidnapper at all, but by someone trying to construct the appearance of a kidnapper? But that was only the beginning, because the deeper linguistic anomalies were still ahead. Language that feels over-explained. The next layer of analysis focused on explanatory tone. Certain segments of the note reportedly contained unusually explicit clarification of conditions and expectations. At first, this seemed helpful. Clear communication, no ambiguity. But investigators quickly recognized a problem. In genuine ransom situations, offenders rarely over-explain, because over-explaining increases exposure. It creates linguistic fingerprints. It risks contradiction. And yet this note contained structured clarification that felt almost instructional in nature, as if the writer was not just issuing demands, but ensuring those demands were interpreted correctly. And that level of linguistic precision introduces another psychological signal: fear of misunderstanding or control over interpretation. But control over interpretation is not always about clarity. Sometimes it is about directing perception, and that distinction is critical. FBI behavioral analysis context. According to references from FBI behavioral analysis frameworks on structured threat communications, investigators often examine whether language patterns reflect genuine emotional escalation or constructed narrative design. In this case, internal comparisons reportedly highlighted something unusual. The ransom note did not behave like spontaneous communication. It behaved like edited communication. And edited communication in criminal contexts is rare because most offenders do not revise under pressure. They react, they leak emotion, they collapse into inconsistency. But here, the message does not collapse, it holds. And that stability is exactly what made investigators uneasy, because stability in a ransom note does not always mean control. Sometimes it means distance. Distance between the writer and the act itself. As linguistic analysts mapped repeated phrasing, structured segmentation, and over-explained instructions together, a new behavioral profile began forming, not of a panicked abductor, but of a communicator aware of how communication will be analyzed, someone who understands structure, tone, expectation, and possibly even investigative interpretation itself. And that creates a dangerous implication. If the writer understands how investigators think, then the message may not be evidence of the crime. It may be a response to anticipated investigation, a psychological preemptive move designed to guide interpretation before analysis even begins. Because real ransom notes usually don't sound like this. They don't anticipate scrutiny, they don't maintain perfect structure, and they don't simulate clarity with this level of precision. So investigators were left with one final unsettling question. Are they analyzing the mind of a kidnapper or the mind of someone constructing the illusion of one? And once that question entered the case file, the investigation stopped being about language and started becoming about deception itself. But what investigators uncovered next would push that idea even further than anyone expected. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries. Investigator theories and contradictions. By the time investigators reached this stage of the case, the ransom note was no longer being treated as a simple piece of evidence. It had become something far more complex, a point of division. Because within law enforcement circles, two competing interpretations began to emerge almost immediately, and neither of them could fully explain what they were seeing. The official theory. According to early investigative direction, authorities initially treated the case as a standard ransom-driven kidnapping, a targeted abduction, with the ransom note serving as direct confirmation of motive. Police and investigative teams initially operated under the assumption that Nancy Guthrie had been taken by an offender seeking financial leverage. This interpretation was supported by the presence of a written demand, which is a common feature in extortion-based abduction cases. But even within the official framework, certain inconsistencies were quietly acknowledged. Because while the structure of the case appeared familiar, the behavior inside it did not. Investigators reportedly maintained the working hypothesis of a single offender acting under financial motive due to procedural necessity. But internally, some analysts began to question whether that framework was too narrow, because it explained the what, but not the how, and more importantly, not the why it felt staged. But this is where the case begins to fracture, because not everyone agreed with the official interpretation, not even within investigative circles. Conflicting interpretations. As the ransom note underwent deeper review, alternative readings began to surface. Some behavioral specialists and linguistic analysts reportedly raised concerns that the document did not fully align with standard kidnapping communication patterns. Different expert interpretations emerged regarding tone, structure, and intent. Some focused on its controlled language, others on its lack of emotional volatility. And the divergence in interpretation created tension within the investigative process, because two completely different conclusions were being drawn from the same document. One group believed the note indicated a highly organized offender with high psychological dominance traits. Another group suggested something far more unusual, that the communication may not represent the offender at all, but instead a constructed message designed to simulate offender behavior. And that possibility introduced a dangerous shift in thinking, because if the note was constructed rather than natural, then the case itself may not be what it appears to be. Evidence that doesn't fit. As analysts revisited the ransom note, specific inconsistencies began to surface more clearly. Certain linguistic and structural elements did not align with expected behavioral patterns seen in genuine ransom communications. At first, these inconsistencies were considered minor, isolated anomalies, but as they were grouped together, a pattern emerged. Timing became one of the first contradictions. The note appeared too early in the investigative timeline, almost synchronized with the discovery of the disappearance itself, which raised an uncomfortable question. How does a message demanding negotiation appear so quickly unless it was already prepared? Then came the language mismatches. Some sections of the note appeared overly structured, while others felt almost artificially simplified, as if two different communication styles were present within a single document. And investigators reportedly began asking whether this inconsistency could indicate multiple layers of intent, or even multiple contributors. But that idea was never confirmed. It remained a theory, hovering just outside official acknowledgement. At this stage, investigators were no longer debating what the note said. They were debating what kind of mind could produce it, because the contradictions were stacking too quickly to ignore. A structured message, but inconsistent tone. A controlled narrative, but mismatched linguistic flow. And that led to one unsettling realization inside the analysis room. If this is a real kidnapping message, it is one of the most unusual ever documented. But if it is not, then what exactly are they analyzing? Psychological theory angle. This is where the case entered its most unstable phase of interpretation,
because psychological profiling introduced three competing possibilities. No single behavioral model fully explained the ransom note when all inconsistencies were considered together. Each theory answered some questions, but created even more contradictions. Genuine kidnapper theory. The note was written by a highly controlled offender with strong cognitive discipline and emotional suppression. But this theory struggles to explain the overstructured language and lack of emotional leakage. Staged communication theory. The note may have been designed to simulate a kidnapping scenario, constructed to guide investigators toward a specific narrative. But this raises an even larger question. Who benefits from delaying or redirecting an investigation in its earliest phase?
Misdirection theory. Some analysts reportedly considered the possibility that the note was not intended to communicate truth at all, but to obscure it. A psychological diversion. A document designed to occupy investigators while real actions unfolded elsewhere. And this theory introduces a chilling implication. The ransom note may not be the center of the crime. It may be the distraction from it. Authority framework. According to behavioral analysis principles referenced in FBI-style threat assessment discussions, structured communication in criminal contexts is often evaluated not only for content, but for intent alignment. Does the message reflect emotional urgency or cognitive control? And in this case, investigators reportedly found that the alignment was inconsistent across multiple layers of analysis, meaning the message did not behave like a single unified psychological profile. It behaved like a constructed artifact. And that distinction is critical, because artifacts can be designed. The breaking contradiction. As investigators compiled all interpretations, one contradiction stood above all others. The ransom note appears both too structured to be emotional and too inconsistent to be purely calculated, which leaves investigators in a paradox because it does not fully fit any known behavioral category. Not panic, not dominance, not chaos, not clarity. Instead, it exists in a hybrid psychological space that resists classification. And in investigative terms, that is often the most dangerous kind of evidence, because it does not reveal intent, it conceals it. And this is where the case becomes even more complicated, because if the ransom note cannot be reliably classified as either genuine communication or deliberate misdirection, then investigators are forced to confront a far more unsettling possibility, that every assumption built on this document may be structurally flawed from the beginning. And if that foundation is wrong, then everything that follows it may also be wrong. But what investigators discovered next would challenge even that idea in ways no one inside the case was prepared for. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries.